Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Eco Show. This is episode number 7. I'm Henry, an ecologist, and this is a show about news, research, and other happenings in ecology and environmentally related things. We've got a cool show today, and I've got a more professional setup going on now, so hopefully this audio is sounding good. I've got a nice little microphone, and hopefully I don't have to record this twice like I did last week. So that the structure of the show is that I go through an animal of the week and then some recent research in ecology and the environment or eco-related things, and then some good news. So the animal of the week this week is the tuatara, which is a reptile that is endemic to New Zealand. Endemic just means that that's where things move around a lot, but it's been there for a really long time, enough so that we would say it's from there. It wasn't introduced recently. And they look like lizards, as there'll be an image here, but they are their own distinct lineage. And tuatara in Te Reo, which is the first language in Aotearoa, New Zealand, means peaks on the back, so little peaks. And you'll see in the image that they have got little ridges, little peaks. And in their sort of classification there of the Rhynchocephalia order, and they're the only species left from that order. So that was an order of reptile from way back in the day. And order is just a classification in the hierarchy of species and animal classifications. And so there's only one left of those, and the rest may have gone extinct due to competition with lizards or mammals. And so, like we said, lizards are actually, the tuatara is technically not a lizard, but this may have lost in competition with them. But because there aren't any other, I believe there aren't any other lizards in Aotearoa, that means that they're hanging out, they're doing their own thing. They're getting to set the scene. They can be up to 80 centimeters long, which is just a little bit over 2 feet long. That's including their tail. And in Aotearoa, they were wiped out on the mainland by mammals. So mammals were introduced and could just smell them out, eat their eggs, things like that, could knock them out. But in Aotearoa, there are many offshore islands, and they have survived on these offshore islands for a long time. They can live up to 100 years old, and I was reading that the oldest they've recorded them being able to breed was a 100-year-old male and an 80-year-old female were able to successfully have some little tuatara buddies. So that's pretty cute. Keeping the family going. And what else have we got? They don't get new teeth. So 100 years with no new teeth. So what they eat and everything has to progress through time. And we've got a alarm going in the distance, a siren. So hopefully that's not too loud, but I can hear it. Yeah, so they have just a set of teeth that wears down over time, so they have to gradually shift what they're eating to softer and softer foods, which is similar to in humans. They also have a third eye, which is very cool. And I'll put an image here of either what it looks like for them. Actually, I'll do an example of it in another lizard, or another, I shouldn't say another lizard, in another reptile, because other reptiles have this. And for tuatara, it's a third eye right about here, but in them it's sort of, they don't have a forehead like this, but it's visible when they're young, and then it gets covered up sort of by scales. And this third eye is called the parietal eye, and it has cornea and retina, which are things in our eyes, and it is connected to the brain. So the use of this is currently sort of unknown, but some ideas are that it can absorb UV rays and provide vitamin D production by being able to absorb UV rays. So there's a few in Aotearoa, there are a few breweries that are called like the Third Eye, I think Third Eye Brewery or Tuatara, and that's sort of what they're referencing. But there are a number of other reptiles that also have this third eye, this parietal eye that connects to the brain. They have no ear holes, but they're able to respond to sound, and their tails can break off and regenerate, but it takes a long time for them to come back and regenerate. They're nocturnal, but they'll come out and lay in the sun, which is definitely a lifestyle that I can get behind. My brain usually feels better at night, but I do like laying out in the sun. Maybe I have relatives that are part of a lost order of rhynchocephalia. Maybe. What else have we got? What other information? Oh, the hatchlings. So we've just said that tuatara are nocturnal, which means they move around at night, but their young are diurnal, which just means they're moving around during the day and nighttime. And that's because the adults are cannibalistic. So they've got to avoid the adults and probably some other predator guys. But the idea that they're diurnal is because the adults might eat them. They have low body temperature and low metabolism, which may be part of one of the reasons why they can live so long. And I have a pretty slow metabolism as well, so hopefully that pays off. The evidence is mounting that I'm related to, not necessarily tuatara, but maybe a lost cousin. They will eat birds and eggs, and so the surviving populations on islands have gone around and been eating little seabirds and eggs, and they guard territory, and they can bite, and apparently this bite is no joke. So, and I was really surprised by this, because they've only been on these islands offshore, and they have been reintroduced to some areas on land in mainland islands or fenced sanctuaries. Darn fenced sanctuaries. But the population size is estimated at 60 to 100,000 individuals. And if that's wrong, please correct me. But I think I was just looking through the Wikipedia for all this information, which was remarkable. And they're not really far down on the endangered species list at all, even though if you introduce mammals to those islands, they would be, I imagine, wiped out pretty quickly. But where they are currently, there's a lot of them. And let's see. The last couple of information items about them. There are concerns that rising global temperatures may lead to many males because during the egg stage, the external temperature can dictate what sex the tuatara come out as. And so there's some concern that there may be a large proportion of males as temperatures rise up. And there's a lot of spiritual and other significance to the tuatara. They have a lot of meaning to Maori in Aotearoa, but that's not something I'm familiar about or something for me to really talk on, but it's something to acknowledge. So they're really special for all of these little factoids and many more reasons out there. So that is the animal of the day, the tuatara, or animal of the week. Animal of my day, that's my animal for the day. And that's your animal for the week. That's all you're getting. Sorry. Okay. We're moving over to research now. We've got a lot of articles this week. Too, I'm just going to read the headlines because they're pretty straightforward, but a few of them I'm going to go more in depth with. And we are in the journal called Ecosphere this week. And sorry, I just had a big drink before this, so I'm experiencing revenge of the beverage. Yep, the journal's Ecosphere. Lots of really cool articles this week that were really interesting to read. The first one was looking at the problem of agricultural landscapes and how they have been homogenized. So you have single crops being grown in large areas, and the problem that leads to is that there's less diversity in the pollinators that will be coming through there. So if you just have one crop, then that may lead to a smaller number of species in that general area that move through to pollinate it because they may be the best adapted to pollinate it. So the problem that they're really looking at is decreased pollinator and diversity and abundance due to monocultural agricultural landscapes. And in response to this, farmers have tried various things such as letting nearby meadows overgrow or planting floral strips to promote diversity. And they looked at the researchers looked at the impact of these measures on colony size. In particular in bees, they're looking at colony size during nectar and pollen collecting season. And the impact of these, they were looking at the impact of these agroecological measures on colony sizes at these different times. So they're looking to see how does this improve the size at spring and then in springtime, and then how does that sort of domino effect onwards after that. And they found that by growing these, I think in particular it was the most effective thing they found was just sort of letting meadows overgrow. So instead of mowing the grass down, letting it grow and letting there be wildflowers and things like that, they found that there was improved colony sizes for these bee species throughout the year when meadows were allowed to overgrow. So the sort of message from that being that was beneficial. So maybe let your lawn overgrow a little bit. You don't have to never cut it, but if you see little bees and bugs, if you have lawn or if you have a house plant, I've got a houseplant that I think is trying to flower right now, but I don't really want bugs in here. But if you have outside space, sometimes flowering with certain plants, I think if they flower, they can die. So maybe check into it first. But that was cool to find that one, that farmers are interested. Well, they'll have better results if they have better pollinators. So it's in everybody's best interest if you have more diverse pollinator populations. And that was titled Agroecological Measures in Meadows Promote Honeybee Colony Development and Winter Survival. That was by Julie Hernandez et al. So let's move on now to another response of a species to changes in things. And I don't think there's a photo for that. For that last one, there will be for this one. And so this next paper that I'm looking at, the problem that they're looking at is that salmon populations are threatened. You may have heard about this or seen it, but I'll show a photo here of salmon being translocated up rivers, and that's partially been due to dams and needing to move them around those or low areas of water. So there are lots of, and salmon is a fish. If you don't know what a salmon is, it's a very tasty fish as well, but don't let them hear me say that. So these populations are threatened because there's so many things. If climate change wasn't enough, they've got dams, they've got agricultural pollution, there are lots of things that are threatening these populations. And so they are wondering, these researchers were wondering, can habitat restoration increase resilience to climate change? So that may be restoration of trees and bushes and things along waterways, because sometimes it may just be grassy right up to the edge of waterways. And growing trees and things like that can provide shade over waterways and can make them cooler, the waterways cooler and things like that. Certain plants, though, can actually lead to more water getting taken out of the ground. So you'd want to be aware of what you're planting for restoration. But yes, they're looking at if restoration will increase resilience to climate change for salmon. And they're defining resilience for salmon as stable or increasing population sizes. So these positive, like I mentioned, positive impacts of habitat restoration may include flood flow, so minimizing flood flow, lower speed of water movement, and stream temperature. So if you've got different plants and things growing around, then during flooding events there are more things to catch up the water and to slow it down, so slower movement of the water, which would be easier for salmon to move upwards, and could also take out some pollutants and things like that. And the results that they found is that restoring habitats with the greatest potential increased resilience for all species. So there's multiple species of salmon, but different species found improvement maximized in different ways. So by restoring a habitat that has the highest potential for improvement, you saw the best benefit overall, but each species has its own sort of special sauce to improve for it. So it sort of says that habitat restoration does have a general improvement impact overall for salmon, but if you want to focus your benefits on a particular species, then there would be good reason to focus on specific measures. And I'm going to put up an image now that's going to cover my face, actually. And this is what they used. This is, I forgot what the name of this model is, but it's a specific model that is used by, and I also forget who made it, but I think it was the U.S. Department of Agriculture or somebody like that. And they have got this model here, which looks really complex on the surface, but we'll just break it down, walking through that and I'm putting my hand over my face to indicate to myself later to keep the thing there. And the thing by that, I mean the image. And so on this top level, we've got, and so if you're listening, I'm just showing a graph, which is sort of or I'm showing an image that shows how they can figure out what restoration actions are going to have the most benefit. So I'm actually going to start from the bottom. So at the bottom of this image, we have the outputs that they are trying to get from a given restoration action. And the outputs that they want are salmon population abundance and productivity. So that's the major output that they want. And a layer above that overall output, you need things like spawning capacity, egg productivity, rearing capacity. Those are all the mechanisms that will directly lead to increased salmon population, and those are the life cycle impacts of that. The layer above that are habitat conditions that will lead to these good life cycle conditions. So those are things like spawning area, rearing area, habitat type, and so on. And then the last layer above that, of these 4 layers, are restoration actions that can improve the habitat conditions that have direct impacts on those life cycle things that you need to get working to increase the population. So it's a really cool mechanistic understanding, and there are arrows that point between what action for restoration will improve what habitat condition, which will then improve the life cycle and ultimately lead to productivity. So there's lots of options here. So you could see how, in general, doing restoration would have overall impacts, but if certain species had certain life cycle things that need to be focused on, then you would want to go about focusing that in particular ways. So that was a really cool thing, and that's a good look into ecological modeling. And sometimes it can sound complex, but it sort of is like it's almost a domino thing. If I push this button, what's going to happen down the line? So I hope you enjoyed that. And here's my hand up over my face to tell me where to end having that image. So I've been covered this whole time, shrouded by this image. But hopefully if you're just listening, that was descriptive enough as well. But it'll be over on the YouTube if you want to see the image. And that article was by Timothy Beechie et al. And the article was titled, "How Does Habitat Restoration Influence Resilience of Salmon Populations to Climate Change?" This is a little longer episode today, but I did want to talk about that image. Okay, and the next article that we're talking about is about habitat as well for another species, but we're talking about birds now. So we talked about reptiles, we've talked about bees, fish. Now we're talking about birds. We're hitting most of the different animal types. And this is all in the journal Ecosphere, which has had some great articles this month so far. Okay, so this problem that we're looking at is that climate change is predicted to increase the intensity and frequency of weather extremes, which in recent weeks we have seen in many places around the world. And these extreme weather events are going to impact species, as you can imagine. When you have a intense event, that's going to be hard to adapt to in the moment, so you may lose individuals in your population. And a possible solution or buffer to these extreme weather events is landscape heterogeneity, which just means having lots of different tree types, shrubs, things in your landscape. So it's not all one same thing. So you have lots of different habitat types. So if one thing is if one type of habitat is washed out, then species can sort of hide in another habitat type. And when you have that heterogeneity, then that leads to an overall sort of resilience to extreme events. And to understand in particular the sort of benefits of this heterogeneity, it's important to understand how animals use space in the landscape for their conservation. And they're looking at a non-migratory species of bird, and so these are particularly susceptible to weather changes or extreme weather events, because they aren't going to go and fly away to another place. They're going to be more restricted locally, and so an intense weather event is going to be pretty impacting on them. And I still haven't revealed what bird it is, so the hand has not gone up for an image. And yeah, so these sort of non-migratory species are expected to be negatively impacted by weather extremes. And they were looking at the northern bobwhite, also known as Calinus virginianus, virginianus. That's the Latin name. And it's a non-migratory bird, and so they want to see how weather changes would impact their movements. And they found that during hot and bright weather, they were found in trees, so they sort of tracked their movements and things. And in hot weather with high wind and cool weather with low wind, they were in shrubs. So you can think it sort of makes sense that higher canopy trees might be cooler, so they would be a good place to be in hot and bright weather. But in windy weather or cold weather, you'd want to be in a shrub where it is sort of going to protect you from those elements. And so the finding from that was that, yes, habitat heterogeneity is important for this species of bird. And so it sort of underlines this importance to understand where different species are spending their time and under what conditions, because they may be threatened by different weather changes. So if you own a landscape, be sure to keep it heterogeneous, because the northern bobwhite prefers it that way. And the title of that article was, "Does Weather Drive Habitat Use and Movement of a Non-Migratory Bird?" That was by L.K. Neumann et al. Okay, our last full article, and then we've got a couple of headlines and good news. So hang in there, almost there. And this article is looking at, again, we have lots of climate change related problems. So climate change and human caused habitat loss is the problem, that the sort of the overarching problem that they're looking at. And these changes, this was a good article. I'm not going to do it justice, but it's open access. And so if you're interested in reading a paper, this would be my recommended read of the week. So they're looking at the impacts of climate change, habitat loss, and the impacts that human decisions have on habitat and species. So these changes from climate change and habitat loss have a big impact on foundation species, which are the species that are sort of define an environment. So it could be type of grass, type of tree, it could be a large mammal or bird that's really important in that environment, but they kind of are what the name implies. They're foundational to that space. And these foundation species create locally stable environmental conditions and strongly influence ecosystem services. So what they were looking at was multiple different case studies in Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And a case study is sort of a overview of a phenomenon or something that's happening in a particular area. And case studies are really important because you get a lot of information and data from these, and then they can be used later in meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is just something that's looking at a lot of different studies. But case studies are sort of like the bricks that more complex research is built on top of. Or so I would say. And yeah, so they're looking at, and we've got sirens rolling in. So the sirens are indicating that this is an important thing to pay attention to. I don't know if you can, I've got this microphone now, so I don't know if it picks it up, but I can hear it. Anyways, so yeah, and it's getting louder. We're going to keep moving on. So these case studies are in southern Great Plains grasslands, coastal Louisiana wetlands, southern Great Plains wetlands, and the Cross Timbers ecoregion, which I believe was in New Mexico. And what they were finding was that foundation species, I should read this before I have stuff written down, and I don't always remember exactly what it is, but I don't always write it necessarily in a way that's readable. Sometimes I write it in a way that's meant to summarize what the finding is, but then if I try to read it, it doesn't make sense. So something they're pointing out is that in many places in the U.S., there have been wide-scale impacts by humans that have changed what the foundation species are. And in some places, the foundation species are actually invasive species now. And a big problem that they were talking about is that when you have multiple generations of people in an area where invasive species such as a grass or growing trees for timber, when you've had that for multiple generations, people become more connected to that than the actual foundation species that define that space, and which may actually have more environmental benefits. And most of the time, this change in foundation species is caused by humans via either management decisions like tree species that were grown or fragmentation that has broken up populations of things. So climate change is impacting these foundation species, but what they're pointing out is that really some of the bigger threats to foundation species are actually human decisions and prioritizing invasive species that may be beneficial for economic gains over a species that is the original species that had the big benefit to the environment originally. So it's an interesting sort of philosophical thing that they grapple with, and the case study is really interesting in this. So this is almost more of a preview or a taster for this paper that was really good and really well put together, talking about case studies, talking about how do you decide when to restore something, when it's going to be costly, and when people on the ground may not actually be pro-restoration of an original ecological thing if it's not economically productive. So very cool article, that one, grappling with some current issues. And I liked that they were talking about that sometimes the biggest threat to these ecosystems, I mean, climate change is human caused, but they're talking about even more directly human caused things are threat to these environments. So really interesting things to think about. Okay, and we had a few headlines from Ecosphere which were important. Okay, and the title of that article was, so you can find it, is Assessing Impacts of Climate Change on Selected Foundation Species and Ecosystem Services in South Central USA. And they don't mean the neighborhood in Los Angeles. They're talking about Louisiana, Oklahoma, those areas. Okay, and the headlines we had, and these are also the titles of the articles: High winds and melting sea ice trigger landward movement and polar bear population of concern. That was by Annie Kellner et al. And I think I'm pretty sure most, if not all, of these articles are open access, so you're able to access these openly. So that's, sea ice. Pretty much never hear good news about sea ice, and that's kind of a thing you'd expect to hear, but still important to know about. And the other headline is that there was high survival following bleaching of, let me read that again. High survival following bleaching underscores the resilience of a frequently disturbed region of the Great Barrier Reef. That was by Cathie Page et al. So they were basically saying that there is some really good survival rates of coral following these bleaching events. However, as things continue to get warmer and warmer, that may shift populations. So kind of some good news and some bad news from that one. Okay, and some more specific good news. I'm going to start with this one, these are both from Good News Network. Again, this one kind of seemed like a bit of greenwashing, but still interesting nonetheless, but I'm not too aware of this thing, so it may not be as good as it sounds. But there is a eutrophication issue in Finland, which basically means there's too many nutrients coming from agriculture going into waterways, and that leads to algae, which are plants in the water. So when you have nutrients in the water, algae are like, yum, 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 I'm going to grow. They grow, but then they take oxygen out of the water when they die, because when they're dead and they're being decomposed, the things that decompose them use oxygen. And that can lead to big fish kills, and there can be other impacts. And what they're talking about is converting this algae into other uses, and the group is called Origin by Ocean. So they're converting this algae into other things. There are ways to convert it into things that can be used, like plastics. So kind of cool, but also it's like, how about we solve the initial issue that's leading to the algae? And if you want algae to make stuff, then grow it somewhere where it's not the consequence of, pollution upstream. And the other article this was just this one was also a little bit, it was interesting. I've been thinking about it. This last one is that research in Finland is showing that spending time in green spaces is associated with less need for prescription drugs. And this was regardless of age or income. But the thing that I was sort of thinking was like, well, if you have more time or access to spend time in green spaces, then that may, mean that, and I think they're talking about prescription drugs for mental illness. So, yep, so they found that. But I have been thinking about it afterwards, so I don't take any prescription drugs for anything at the moment, but it still was, you hear things about being in green spaces being beneficial. So this was just sort of this is a popular news article about research that was done that found that being in green spaces can basically be beneficial, and they found some evidence for that. So if you have the time, think about, some people may just not have any free time, but if you have free time that's spent doing things that are not being in green spaces, then do you have a yard? Do you have a tree you can sit by and spend time under? It really does feel actually so good. Like, it's the sort of complete opposite of the feeling that you get from sitting and looking at your phone. At least after looking at my phone, I feel drained and pretty zonked. But if you go and sit around a tree or at the beach or different places, you feel different things in each different place, but usually feel pretty energized. So that was all we had for this week. Bit of a longer one, so I hope that was enjoyable, and we'll catch you around soon. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.